There is a photograph from February of 2007 taken at a hotel in Las Vegas that almost nobody outside the family paid much attention to at the time. In it, an aging Elizabeth Taylor, one of the most photographed women who ever lived, sits at the center of a small group of ordinary-looking middle-aged people. There are no other movie stars in the frame. No paparazzi frenzy. Just a mother celebrating her 75th birthday, surrounded by 4 grown adults who happen to be her children. And the striking thing about that picture is how completely unremarkable those 4 people look. You would never guess, passing them on the street, that they were the sons and daughters of the most famous, most glamorous, most scandalized woman in the history of American film. That, in a single image, is the great secret of Elizabeth Taylor's family. The woman herself lived every day of her life inside a hurricane of fame. 8 marriages, 7 husbands, 2 Oscars, diamonds the size of ice cubes, a private life so relentlessly public that she once compared it to a soap opera. And yet the 4 children she raised inside that hurricane almost all did the exact same thing when they grew up. They walked away from it. They became sculptors and sound technicians and quiet suburban parents. They fled the spotlight their mother lived under, and they built lives so private that most of the world has no idea they exist at all. And that raises a genuinely fascinating question. How does a woman who was, by any measure, one of the most famous human beings on the planet, raise 4 children who wanted nothing to do with fame at all? It would have been so easy for those children to become the familiar cautionary tale, the spoiled, aimless heirs of a celebrity, coasting on a legendary name, chasing the reflected light of their mother's stardom. Instead, almost to a person, they did the opposite. They learned crafts. They did unglamorous work. They protected their own children from the very machine that had shaped their childhoods. Understanding why they made that choice, and what it cost each of them to get there, means understanding 4 very different people who happen to share one extraordinary mother. But their stories, once you actually look at them, are anything but ordinary. One of them was orphaned by a plane crash before he could form a single memory, then went on to build one of the most famous families in the world through marriage. One of them married directly into a cursed billionaire dynasty and found himself entangled in the aftermath of a notorious kidnapping and a devastating diagnosis. One of them never met her own father and grew up to shape wildlife out of bronze in the quiet of upstate New York. And one of them arrived from a war-torn foreign country as a baby who could barely walk, and endured a childhood of surgeries most people could not imagine. Their names were Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria, the 4 children of Elizabeth Taylor. And what became of them, long after their mother's final curtain fell, is a story about what it really means to be raised by a legend, and to choose deliberately not to become one. Let's begin with the eldest, the son who traded Hollywood for a chisel and a block of stone, Michael Wilding Jr. The eldest who chose stone, Michael Howard Wilding Jr., was born in January of 1953. Elizabeth Taylor's firstborn child, the son of her second husband, the elegant British actor, Michael Wilding. As the eldest of the 4, Michael occupied a strange and unique position in the family. He was old enough to remember, faintly, a version of his mother before superstardom had completely swallowed her whole life, but still young enough to grow up almost entirely inside the chaos of it. Like several of his siblings, Michael had a brush with the movie business as a child, appearing briefly as an extra in his mother's famous 1967 film, alongside his stepfather Richard Burton. And unlike most of his siblings, he actually tried to make a real go of acting as an adult. In the 1980s, Michael Wilding Jr. pursued a genuine acting career, landing roles on some of the biggest American television shows of the era, appearing on programs like Dallas and the long-running soap opera Guiding Light. For a stretch of years, it genuinely looked as though the eldest son might carve out his own modest corner of the family business. But it was his personal life, far more than his acting resume, that revealed just how far Michael was willing to drift from the world his mother lived in. Because in the 1970s, before any of the television work, Michael Wilding Jr. did something almost unthinkable for the son of one of the wealthiest and most glamorous women alive. He went to live on a commune, He married a young woman named Beth Clutter in 1970, and for a stretch of years he embraced a countercultural life about as far removed from Beverly Hills mansions and household staff as it is possible to get. He had a daughter, Layla, during that period, and later welcomed a second daughter, Naomi, born in 1975. Sit with that image for a second, because it captures everything about this family's relationship with fame. The eldest son of Elizabeth Taylor, a woman surrounded by bodyguards and housekeepers and diamond vaults, chose to raise his young daughter on a commune during the 1970s, deliberately stepping away from every advantage his last name could have handed him. It was about as complete a rejection of the Hollywood machine as a person could make. And by every account, his mother never held it against him. She stayed present in his life, and in the lives of his children throughout that unconventional stretch, visiting when she could, never once suggesting he owed her a more conventional path. Michael's life eventually settled down. In 1982, he married Brooke Palance, an actress and the daughter of the Oscar-winning tough guy actor Jack Palance, and the two of them had a son, Tarquin, born in 1989. And then, at some point, Michael stepped away from acting almost entirely and reinvented himself one final time. In 1991, he moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and began working as a stone sculptor. Think about the distance in that choice. A film reaches millions of people the moment it is released. A television appearance is seen the very night it airs. Michael Wilding Jr. walked away from all of that instant visibility and toward a craft that offers almost none of it, carving slow, flowing shapes out of marble and limestone, drawing inspiration from the desert landscape around him. He has described the work as something closer to a conversation with the stone itself, and he is drawn, he has said, to the forms that occur naturally when earth and wind and water are left to shape something over long stretches of time, patiently without forcing it. A single sculpture can take months, and there is no undoing a wrong cut once the stone is gone. It is a discipline built entirely on patience and permanence, the exact opposite of the retakes and edited scenes and manufactured images of the world he was born into. That career is still active today. Now in his early 70s, Michael continues to show his sculptures through galleries in both Santa Fe and Los Angeles, his pieces appearing in exhibitions in recent years. He remains one of the more publicly visible of Taylor's four children, at least within the quiet world of fine art, even though he has kept an almost complete distance from the entertainment press for decades. And all three of his children eventually became deeply involved with the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, carrying forward the philanthropic thread their grandmother began, continuing her work into a new generation. But if Michael's path from soap operas to a commune to a sculpting studio in the desert was unpredictable, his younger brother's story took a turn stranger still, colliding with one of the most infamous fortunes and one of the most disturbing crimes of the 20th century. Christopher Wilding, the brother who married a cursed fortune. Christopher Edward Wilding was born on the 27th of February 1955, and in a strange twist, he shares a birthday with his own mother. He was the younger of Taylor's two sons from her marriage to Michael Wilding, and like his older brother, he spent part of his childhood on movie sets almost by default, appearing briefly as an extra in that same 1967 film alongside Richard Burton. He remembered it later with a bit of amusement, the itchy costume, the braces on his teeth, watching his stepfather perform in front of cameras that never seemed to stop rolling. As an adult, Christopher built a steady, deliberately unglamorous career behind the camera rather than in front of it, working in sound and as an assistant director on a handful of films through the 1980s and 1990s. It was the kind of job that generates no headlines whatsoever, and by most accounts that anonymity was exactly what he wanted. Colleagues on those sets reportedly had no idea, at least at first, that the quiet crew member handling the sound equipment was the son of one of the most famous women alive. But his personal life would end up generating plenty of attention, whether he wanted it or not. In 1981, Christopher married a young woman named Aileen Getty. The name should sound familiar. Eileen was the granddaughter of the oil tycoon J. Paul Getty, who at the time was considered one of the wealthiest private individuals who had ever lived, a man whose fortune was frequently compared to the entire economic output of small nations. Christopher Wilding, the son of Hollywood royalty, had married directly into American oil royalty. But that staggering wealth came bundled with a level of tragedy that had shocked the entire world less than a decade before Christopher and Eileen ever met. Eileen's brother, John Paul Getty III, had been kidnapped in Rome in 1973 when he was just 16 years old. His captors demanded an enormous ransom. And in one of the coldest episodes in the history of American wealth, the family patriarch, the boy's own grandfather, initially refused to pay, reportedly telling reporters that if he paid for one grandchild, he would have 14 more kidnapped by morning. The standoff dragged on for months. To force the family's hand, the kidnappers eventually caused the teenager serious and permanent physical harm and sent evidence of it to a newspaper. Only then was a reduced ransom paid, and the young man released after roughly 5 months in captivity. He survived, but he was never the same, and years later he suffered a medical crisis that left him with lifelong, life-altering disabilities. That was the shadow hanging over the family Christopher Wilding married into. The couple reportedly eloped quietly, largely because the idea of a proper high society wedding between two families like theirs, either name capable of drawing a media circus on its own, felt like more than either of them wanted to take on. Eileen carried the weight of her brother's ordeal into that marriage. She later spoke about how it had left her with a lasting suspicion, not of people exactly, but of wealth itself, and of the sense of protection that money was supposed to buy but so clearly had not. The couple had 2 sons, adopting one and then welcoming a biological son, and for a little while it looked as though the family might settle into something steady. Then things began to unravel. And then came the discovery that would end Christopher's marriage and, in a strange and unexpected way, help shape one of the most important chapters of Elizabeth Taylor's entire life. Because in the mid-1980s, Eileen Getty learned that she had contracted HIV. This was during the absolute height of the public panic and misinformation surrounding the disease, a period when a diagnosis like hers could destroy friendships and careers overnight, not just marriages. Christopher and Eileen divorced by the late 1980s, with Christopher taking on primary care of their 2 young sons in the years that followed. But here is where the story takes its most remarkable turn. Eileen did not disappear from the family after the divorce. She and Elizabeth Taylor stayed close for the rest of Taylor's life, and by every account, Taylor never treated her former daughter-in-law with anything resembling judgment. Many people close to the family have said that watching Eileen go through that experience up close played a real part in pulling Elizabeth Taylor into AIDS activism at a moment when the cause carried enormous stigma and almost no major public figures wanted anything to do with it. Taylor became one of the earliest and most visible celebrity advocates for HIV and AIDS research anywhere in the world, eventually founding her own foundation dedicated entirely to the cause. Eileen, for her part, became a long-term survivor and built a genuine second career around advocacy, and she remains connected to Elizabeth Taylor's foundation to this day. The 2 women stayed close right up until Taylor's death in 2011. As for Christopher, he eventually remarried to a supervising sound editor named Margaret Carlton, and the couple had a son together in 1992. He has stayed almost entirely out of the public eye ever since, continuing to work in the film industry on projects most audiences would never connect to his family name. And he holds on to one particularly meaningful piece of his mother's legacy. After her death, Christopher took possession of the very first Academy Award Elizabeth Taylor ever won, the Oscar for her 1961 film. He has said that as children, he and his brother were allowed to play with their mother's Golden Globes, but never the Oscars, and now he proudly displays that first Oscar on a bookshelf in his living room, not as a trophy for visitors to admire, but as a treasured connection to the mother he loved. 2 sons down, and already a pattern is emerging, of children who fled the spotlight and built quiet, complicated lives far from the cameras. But the daughter who came next carried perhaps the heaviest weight of all from the very beginning of her life, because she lost her father before she was old enough to even remember his face. Liza Todd, the daughter who never knew her father. In the summer of 1957, Elizabeth Taylor was about as happy as she would ever be. She was married to the flamboyant film producer Mike Todd, a man friends described as one of the great loves of her life. And on August 6th of that year, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elizabeth, but everyone in the family simply called her Liza. For a few months, the household built around that baby looked like the calmest and happiest one Taylor had known in years. That calm did not last. In March of 1958, Mike Todd boarded his private plane, a small aircraft he had affectionately nicknamed the Lucky Liz in honor of his wife, and set off on a business trip. Somewhere over New Mexico, the plane ran into a violent storm and crashed. Everyone aboard was killed. Liza Todd was not yet 8 months old. She would grow up without a single conscious memory of the man who had given his plane her mother's nickname, knowing him only through photographs, home movies, and whatever stories other people chose to share with her. Elizabeth Taylor, by every account, never fully recovered from that loss. She was 26 years old, suddenly a widow with an infant daughter, and she was expected to grieve in front of a press corps that gave her almost no privacy at all. In the years that followed, her life kept moving at a dizzying pace, through her scandalous marriage to Eddie Fisher, and then her legendary, tumultuous romance with Richard Burton. And Burton, for a time, became something close to a real father figure for the young Liza. He would go on to formally adopt her, and those who watched them together said the bond was genuine, outlasting even his marriage to her mother. But through all the noise of her mother's life, Liza herself grew into someone almost nobody expected. Where Elizabeth thrived under attention, Liza seemed to shrink from it entirely. People who knew her as a young woman describe her as watchful and quiet, far more at ease around horses than around a room full of adults. She appeared in family photos at premieres because she had no choice, but she never once tried to turn that access into a career of her own. Instead, she found something that had nothing to do with cameras at all. She picked up a chisel. Liza studied art seriously, at Hornsey College of Art in London and the Art Institute in Los Angeles, and she trained as a sculptor, working mostly in bronze. And she built a genuine reputation in a corner of the art world that has almost nothing to do with celebrity, depicting horses and wildlife with the kind of anatomical accuracy that takes years to earn. By many accounts, she never once traded on her famous last name to get a gallery's attention. Many of the people she worked with for years apparently had no idea who her mother was until someone else mentioned it. She had learned her craft the old-fashioned way, studying anatomy and movement, spending countless hours simply watching horses in a field before she ever touched a block of clay, because getting the proportions even slightly wrong is the difference between a sculpture that feels alive and one that does not. In 1984, Liza married a fellow artist named Hap Tivey, and the two settled onto a large wooded property in the Hudson Valley, about as far from Beverly Hills as a life can get. They raised 2 sons together, Quinn, born in 1986, and Reese, born in 1990. To those boys, their grandmother was not a global icon. She was simply the woman who showed up for birthdays and asked pointed questions about their schoolwork. Liza and Hap eventually separated in 2003 after nearly 20 years of marriage, but by most accounts the split was gentle. Her sculpting only deepened with time. One of her most talked-about pieces was a life-sized bronze of a rescue dog, cast using material recovered from the wreckage of the World Trade Center, made as a tribute to the search and rescue teams who worked there after September 11th. It was not a commissioned piece, and it was not made with any gallery sale in mind. It came from something closer to a personal need to memorialize what she had watched unfold on television, along with everyone else. Later, her focus shifted overseas, toward African wildlife, and she began working directly with an elephant orphanage in South Africa, eventually building an entire exhibition around the animals she came to know there personally. Today, in her late 60s, Liza still lives quietly on that property in upstate New York, mostly out of view, still letting her work speak for her the way it always has. But as difficult as Liza's start in life was, hers is not the story in this family that involved the most physical suffering. That distinction belongs to a little girl who came into the family a few years later, from a country still rebuilding itself after a war, a girl who for a long stretch of her childhood doctors were not entirely sure would ever walk the way other children did. Maria Burton, the girl from Munich who endured. In the early 1960s, while she was married to Eddie Fisher, Elizabeth Taylor began the process of adopting a child from Germany. The girl's name was Maria, born in Munich in the summer of 1961, and her early life had already been shaped by hardship before Taylor ever entered the picture. She had been placed for adoption as an infant, and she had been born with a serious hip deformity, the kind of congenital condition that, left untreated, threatens to leave a child with a permanent, painful limp or worse. Here is a small detail that tells you a great deal about how Elizabeth Taylor approached motherhood. By the accounts of people close to her at the time, she was not discouraged in the slightest by the little girl's medical condition. If anything, it drew her in more. She reportedly told friends she wanted this particular child specifically because she was unwell and because she believed she could help her. She was not avoiding a child who needed more. She was choosing to lean directly into it. The adoption was still being processed when Taylor's marriage to Eddie Fisher fell apart. When she married Richard Burton in 1964, he stepped in and completed the legal adoption himself, and from that point forward he effectively became Maria's father in every way that counted. She took his name and was raised as Maria Burton. And then came one of the most physically difficult chapters in this entire family's history. One that rarely gets discussed, perhaps because it does not fit the glamorous version of this family that most people picture. To correct her hip, Maria went through a long, repeated series of surgeries throughout her childhood. By some counts, close to 20 separate operations. Each one required recovery time. Each one carried its own risks. Each one asked a small child to be brave in a way most adults never have to be. Picture what her actual childhood looked like, day to day. While her siblings were off at school plays or out riding horses, Maria was often recovering, relearning how to walk after another procedure, spending long stretches of time in casts or braces meant to slowly reshape her hip as she grew. Most children spend their early years learning to run and climb without a second thought. Maria spent hers relearning basic movement. Again and again, every time a surgeon reset something inside her hip and sent her home in a cast to start the process over. There were stretches when she simply could not join her brothers and sister on family outings, because her body was not ready for it yet. And yet, by most accounts, she was never set apart or treated as fragile within the household. Taylor apparently made a deliberate point of including her in everything the other children did, refusing to let the medical realities define how the family treated her. She traveled with them. She appeared in every family portrait. She was simply one of the four, Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria, not treated as different because her path into the family had looked different from theirs. And those closest to the family have said that Maria rarely complained and rarely let her difficulties define how she saw herself. By the time she reached her teenage years, whatever hardship remained from those surgeries had mostly faded into the background of an otherwise full and active life. As an adult, Maria moved into design work, spending time in the clothing and fashion world, while staying involved in the charitable causes tied to her mother's name. Her personal life carried its own turbulence, including a marriage to a man named Steve Carson, with whom she had a daughter, and a later marriage that also proved difficult. But through it all, she chose privacy over the endless attention her last name could have provided. She never gave the kind of tell-all interviews that might have been available to her. And that instinct toward privacy seems to run through nearly everything she has chosen since. Today, Maria lives a considerably quieter life in Idaho, largely removed from the entertainment world that shaped so much of her early years, staying connected to her mother's charitable legacy from a comfortable distance. It is worth sitting with the full arc of her story. A girl born into hardship in post-war Germany, adopted into arguably the most famous household on the planet, put through nearly 20 operations just to walk normally. And today, simply a private woman in Idaho, unrecognized by most of the people she passes at the grocery store. Where they are now, and the legacy they carry. More than a decade after Elizabeth Taylor's death in March of 2011, at the age of 79, all four of her children remain connected to one another, and to the legacy she left behind, even as each of them has built an adult life almost entirely outside the spotlight that defined every single day of hers. Michael Wilding Jr., now in his early 70s, still works stone in Santa Fe, showing new pieces in galleries in New Mexico and Los Angeles. Christopher Wilding lives quietly, connected to the film industry behind the scenes, holding on to the pieces of his mother's history that matter to him personally, including that first Oscar on his living room shelf. Liza Todd continues sculpting on her property in upstate New York, her focus increasingly turned toward wildlife and conservation work overseas. And Maria Burton has settled into a private life in Idaho, staying connected to her mother's charitable causes from a comfortable remove. Between the four of them, they gave Elizabeth Taylor 10 grandchildren, several of whom now carry pieces of her legacy forward directly. This is perhaps the most meaningful thread of all. Elizabeth Taylor did something extraordinary in the last decades of her life. She used her enormous fame, at a moment when it carried real personal and professional risk, to become one of the first major celebrities in the world to champion the fight against HIV and AIDS. She founded the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation in 1991 and helped establish AMFAR, the Foundation for AIDS Research, throwing the full weight of her stardom behind a cause that most of Hollywood was too frightened to touch. And that work did not die with her. Michael's 3 children are all involved with the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, continuing the philanthropic thread their grandmother started. Liza's son Quinn became not only an artist, but a trustee overseeing his grandmother's estate and a steward of her foundation, ensuring her charitable mission carries on. Eileen Getty, the former daughter-in-law whose diagnosis helped inspire Taylor's activism in the first place, remains connected to the cause to this day. The grandchildren have spoken movingly about their grandmother, about her boundless generosity, and about how grateful they feel to be able to honor and continue her legacy, especially together. In a sense, the most famous thing about the Taylor family now is not the movies or the diamonds or the 8 marriages. It is the quiet, ongoing work of a family that turned a global icon's compassion into a mission that outlived her. What their story leaves behind. It is tempting, looking back at old footage of Elizabeth Taylor arriving at some premiere in the 1960s, jewelry catching the flashbulbs, to imagine that everything in her world moved at that same glamorous, dizzying pace. But somewhere behind that image, 4 children were doing homework, getting into arguments with each other, healing from surgeries, and quietly deciding, each in their own time, exactly how much of that world they wanted to carry forward into their own lives. Not much of it, as it turned out. When you look at old interviews of Taylor talking about her children, a pattern shows up again and again. She rarely spoke about them in terms of achievements or careers. She spoke about them in terms of how they made her feel. Steady. Grounded. Real. She said that coming home to them after a film shoot or a hospital stay was the one part of her life that never felt like performance. She called them her proudest accomplishment. The 4 loves of her life. And even, in one interview, her best friends. Given how chaotic the rest of her world was, that steadiness may have been the rarest and most precious thing she ever had. A daughter who lost her father before she could remember him picked up a chisel and started shaping something permanent out of raw bronze. A daughter who arrived from hardship overseas and endured nearly 20 surgeries built a quiet family life far from any spotlight at all. A son who once lived on a commune settled into a discipline built entirely around patience, carving stone in the middle of the desert. And a son whose marriage collided with tragedy on a scale most families never come close to experiencing, chose to keep one small, meaningful object from his mother's career close to him, rather than the fame that came with it. Elizabeth Taylor spent her entire career in front of more cameras than almost anyone in the history of American entertainment. Her 4 children spent their adult lives, for the most part, quietly and deliberately staying out of the frame, becoming sculptors and sound editors and private parents, and then raising a generation of grandchildren who now carry their grandmother's compassion forward into the world. Given everything each of them lived through to get there, it is hard not to see that as a legacy all its own, and maybe even the most meaningful one she ever left behind. Not the fame, the family, and the quiet, deliberate grace with which they chose to walk away from the noise and toward something entirely their own. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.